Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome to my virtual classroom. I'm Safia Sultan, your online history instructor for class 8s. Hope my this video finds you happy, healthy and in a very good shape. Nations are born in the hearts of the poets. They prosper and die in the hands of politicians. Children, this quote from Allama Iqbal clearly states the importance of good poets in the life of a nation. And that is what we will discuss and learn today in the further lesson. Okay, before starting the lesson, I would request you to be ready with your mind, keep your booklet with you and your textbook, and be ready with your stationery to note the important points. The chapter we are discussing these days is Communal and Political Awakening. And in this chapter, we will particularly discuss the events which took place in the subcontinent between 1920 to 1930. It will be really appropriate, children, to start our lesson with a short recap. In the last lesson, we discussed about the Sangathan and the Shuddhi movements. They were the radical communal movements which started in India, which tried to bring all the Hindus together, and along with it, it it was planned in such a way to even convert the Muslims also and make them into Hindus, and they were doing all this to fight with the Muslims and increase the Hindu power. And definitely movements like Sangathan and Shuddhi caused communal riots because these movements were designed in such a way that they created hatred among the two communities. Muslims did try to have also the communal movements or religious movements like Tanzeem and Tabligh, but the Muslim movements were very, very small in size and very, very small in impact as well. And you can easily justify this by understanding that Muslims were a small minority. So every movement which they start on their own was not very powerful as compared to the movement started by the Hindu communities. So Sangathan and Shuddhi had a very strong impact on the Indian society. Along with these two movements, there was an introduction of a new political party which was Mahasabha, and it completely talked about Hindustan or India for Hindus only, and that also created a lot of hatred between the Indians. Next event we discussed was the Simon Commission. British sent Simon Commission to India to talk to the Indian leaders to find out what they want as the future constitution of India. And this Simon Commission was a complete failure because this commission was boycotted by Congress and Muslim League both. And along with this, it could not even gain the attention of the masses. People everywhere in India, wherever the Simon Commission visited, cheered them with black flags, and they asked them to go home, and they did not want any role of the British in the Indian politics. Next big event we discussed was the presentation of the Nehru report. Children, when Simon Commission failed, British court asked Indians to sit together and decide something as the future constitution of India. And this plan was made to be fulfilled in the all parties conference. Unfortunately, that all parties conference also failed, and the political parties could not agree upon each other's stances. And this led to British allowing Nehru to design the future constitution of India. And this design or this draft in history is remembered as the Nehru report. If we talk in detail about Nehru report, it demanded the dominion status for India, in which the princely states and British India would join in a federation. And the worst thing which was a part of the Nehru report was it believed in the end of the separate electoral status for the Muslims. and it recommended the joint elections for the Indian elections, and which was a complete disaster for the Muslims. And that is the reason when Nehru report came, Jinnah extended his his goodwill, and he said that Nehru report can be accepted with certain amendments. Definitely the amendments were about the Muslim rights. And very straightforwardly, very bluntly, Nehru and the Congress committee refused to accept those amendments, which resulted in Jinnah also, taking a strong action against it. And then Jinnah came up in history with his 14 points, which were very famous to safeguard the Muslim rights. Okay, so the objectives for today are very simple. We are going to analyze the role of Jinnah's 14 points in the freedom movement of Pakistan, and then we are going to synthesize the contribution of Iqbal from 1928 to 1930. Okay, so let's start with the major part of our lesson today, which is the 14 points of Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Children, before we talk about the 14 points, it's really appropriate to discuss about the reasons which made Jinnah present these 14 points, which were just discussed in the previous slides. And I would like to repeat here that the major reason why Jinnah had to present these reforms was the Nehru report, because the content of the Nehru report was not very much favorable for the Muslims. And definitely, being the leader of the Muslim community, Jinnah had to raise his voice against the Nehru report. Okay, so this was the first reason for presenting 14 points of Jinnah. It was proposed as a constitutional reform plan to safeguard the political rights of Muslims in a self governing India in 1929. These 14 points were his greatest achievement, as they were made the basis of every negotiation made with British or Hindus after the presentation of these points. And they influenced the political thinking of the Muslims for the next 2 decades. In fact, these points now form the basis of Muslim demand. Simply, you can say that they were so comprehensive points, and they talked so nicely about the rights of the minorities, that every time whenever the British asked about the Muslim demands, they immediately refer to the 14 points of Jinnah, that they said that we only want these 14 points to be implemented to give the rights to the Muslims. And you can easily understand with this fact that how important the 14 points of Jinnah were. Okay, coming to the 14 points. Although you will be discussing all of them in detail in your physical classes, but still I would like to talk about some of them which were very, very important. Coming to the I'll read them, but I'll discuss with them, because mostly if you see, Jinnah's 14 points were safeguarding the Muslim rights. Like if you see the last point on this slide, in the central legislature, Muslim representation shall not be less than one third, because Nehru report demanded the power to be shifted to the central government or the federal government, and no more power for the provincial governments. So, to safeguard the Muslim rights, Jinnah demanded that Muslim representation in the center should be not less than one third. Then the most important point here, if you see on the top, separate electorate to continue, so that the Muslims are elected, they get a chance to reach to the legislative bodies, and they play their role over there. Then Muslim minorities in Punjab, Bengal, and NWFP should not be affected by the boundary changes. All religions to have freedom of worship, education, and assembly. This shows the broad mindedness of Jinnah as well, that he did not only talk about the rights of the Muslims as a minority, but he also talked about the other minorities. No law should be agreed affecting a particular religious group unless three-quarters of the members of the legislature belonging to that religion vote for it. If there is anything coming against any religion, the people of that religion have to accept it if it is becoming a law. Since should be a separate province. And then a very important point in the end, reforms should apply to NWFP and Balochistan in the same way as to the other provinces. Children, we all know that NWFP and Balochistan since the beginning were quite poor and less developed areas. So Jinnah even highlighted these areas and wanted these places also to be developed. Then, a very important point now, Muslims should have a proper share of the jobs in the government services. So, if you see, definitely again and again, Jinnah is trying to grab the attention of the British towards the Muslim rights which should be granted to them. Okay, if we talk about the reaction, definitely since the 14 points of Jinnah were quite contradictory with the Nehru report, so Congress and Hindus strongly criticized them and they rejected the Jinnah's 14 points. Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a prominent politician, Hindu politician, regarded them as ridiculous 14 points of Jinnah. And this reaction ultimately prompted Muslims to establish a separate state for themselves. They realized that Hindus are really now in a mood to struggle separately and they really don't want to share power at this moment because now they can foresee that the British are planning to leave. And the idea behind all this, like Nehru report and rejecting the 14 points of Jinnah, was that if the British leave, power should be only and only in the hands of the Hindus so that they don't have to give any power to the other minorities. They clearly stated that once the British leave, they can consider giving power to the minorities, but in front of British, power should be completely in the hands of the Hindus. And this definitely was an alarming situation for the Muslims because they could realize easily that if British leave, only their masters will change. They are being ruled by the British right now, and once British leave, they will be ruled by the Hindus. So it was a very important point at this moment, and it was the need of time for the Muslims to struggle for their power as well. Now, we are going to talk about Allama Iqbal's Allahabad address of 1930. Before we talk about Iqbal's address, we need to understand and remember one thing. Jinnah's 14 points were very bluntly rejected by Congress and the other Hindu leaders, and this made Jinnah very disappointed. And at this stage, Jinnah decided to leave the Indian politics and he moved to London to continue with his law practices. And he was almost away from the Indian practice. And this made Allama Iqbal come forward and look after the matters of All India Muslim League. Yes, you can see the picture of the visionary poet Iqbal on your screens. Okay, if we now talk about the address of Iqbal, Iqbal presided over the All India Muslim League session at Allahabad. If we have discussed and you must have get to know about it by now because these political parties have gained momentum now, and every year they used to have their political gathering. So this political gathering in 1930 was planned in Allahabad. In this address, in this speech, Iqbal particularly demanded a separate state for the Muslims so that they could have a majority over there and follow the religion and live there respectfully and peacefully. It was actually asked to protect the Muslim faith and culture. Children, at this point in 1930, Jinnah Iqbal demanded the northwestern Indian Muslim state, which included NWFP, Balochistan, Sindh, and Punjab. He believed that this is the solution to all the Muslim problems because these areas are Muslim majority areas, and he said these can be separated as a separate Muslim state with British on their heads or without British. Now, we are going to talk about Iqbal's role in the awakening of the Muslims. Children, we all know Iqbal as a poet, as a philosopher, and as a thinker. He was called as the poet of East. Now, why is he called the poet of East? Let me explain this to you. Iqbal did not write his poetry in Urdu only. Remember, the major languages Iqbal used for his poetry were Persian and even English also. And making writing in Persian made him popular in all the Eastern countries where Persian is spoken very frequently. Like you can call some Central Asian states, people love Iqbal over there. Then if you come to Iran, the Persian people of Iran, they love Iqbal over there. Even now in India, Iqbal is hailed as a hero. And Pakistan, he is actually our national poet. So being a hero and being a poet, favorite poet of so many Eastern countries, makes him gain the title of the poet of East. It was his Tarana for the Hindustan that founded the base of Hindu nationalism. Children, Iqbal wrote a Tarana, a small poem for Hindustan, which uh, which has the words like सारे जहां से अच्छा है हिंदुस्तान हमारा हम बुलबुले हैं इसकी ये गुलसितां हमारा. This type of poems really raised Hindu nationalism, and Hindu community is very much grateful for to Iqbal to write such a beautiful poetry for Hindustan, making them arouse their national feelings. Then, if we talk about the most famous poems of Iqbal, the Shikwa and Jawab Shikwa. And in this poem, in these two poems, Iqbal pointed out the causes of the Muslim downfall. Actually, in this poem, Shikwa, a Muslim is complaining to God about the problems he has in his life, and he's saying that I am a Muslim and I follow the religion designed for me by God, but still I am having these problems. And then again, as a reply to the same shikwa, Jinnah, Iqbal wrote Jawab Shikwa, and in that poem he was actually trying to answer from the God side that this is the lifestyle you should follow, which you are not following, and that is the reason you are suffering. And that is actually highlighting the causes of the Muslim downfall. Then two of the very famous books, Bange Dara and Bale Jibril, focused on the history and background of Muslims. If I talk about children, Bange Dara, it's actually in English we call it the call of the marching bells. If you go back in past, marching bells were rung for the travelers to wake them up and make them realize that it is time for them to move to their next destination. And the sleeping travelers have to get up after ringing of the marching bells and they have to move towards their next destination. This situation or this idea was taken up by Iqbal very, very intelligently. He realized that Muslims are sleeping and they are not aware that it is time for them to pack up and leave for their next destination. And that is the reason he keep this name Bange Dara, and this also tried to awaken the Muslims. And now if I talk about Bale Jibril, Gabriel's Wings. Children, it was the peak of Iqbal's poetry, Urdu poetry particularly. And this poetry tried to awaken the Muslim Ummah. He tried to, arouse the ego, the faith, the knowledge, and the urge for freedom in the Muslims. He even in Bale Jibril talked about the past glory of the Muslims, and all these things were really said by Iqbal to arouse the Muslim nationalism and make Muslims realize that what is the need of time demanding freedom and self-respect especially. His poetry created awareness and gave sense of self-identity to the Indian Muslims. So definitely children, you must have now get the idea why we call him the national poet of Pakistan or why he has the title of the poet of East. Yes. So time to reflect today's learning. Children, assume yourself as Allama Iqbal and think of the issues you will address, the issues of today, and how are you going to address them. You can give this answer in your chat boxes after watching this video. That's end from my side for this week, children. Inshallah, next week we will meet with some new learning. Till then, take special care of yourself. Allah Hafiz.